She was not supposed to be here. If you look at the numbers, at history, and at the cold logic of survival, Oprah Winfrey should have vanished before she turned 15. She was pure statistics, a woman, black, poor, abused, a teenage mother in the segregated South of the United States. The world not only closed its doors to her, it nailed them shut with rotten wood and barbed wire. How does a child who made friends with cockroaches so she wouldn't feel alone become humanity's confidant? How does someone who learned that her body was public property reclaim ownership of her own soul and build a billion-dollar empire based on truth? The answer is not in fame. It lies in the exact moment when she decided that dying was not an option, but living as a victim wasn't either. This is not a story about success. It is a story about surviving hell and coming back to sell tickets at the gate. The heat of Kosciuszko, Mississippi was not just temperature, it was a physical presence, a weight that crushed the lungs of anyone who dared to take too deep a breath. In 1954, the world was divided into black and white, but for little Oprah, the world was brown. Brown like the dry earth where she walked barefoot, brown like the rotting wooden porch of her grandmother Hattie Mae's farm, and brown like the rough, humiliating fabric of the potato sacks her grandmother sewed to serve as dresses. There was no money for fabric, no luxury, not even the dignity of looking like a normal child. While the other children at school wore cotton and ribbons, Oprah walked into the classroom with the mark of misery clinging to her skin, the coarse cloth scratching, announcing to everyone before she even said a word, "I am less. I don't belong." Loneliness was the only constant companion on that isolated farm. No television, no toys, and, many times, no other children around, Oprah's imagination became both her refuge and her curse. She talked to the ears of corn in the field, giving them names, creating complex societies where she was no longer the poor girl in the potato sack, but a queen or a respected teacher. The farm animals were her captive audience. The pigs and chickens listened to her passionate speeches, her Bible recitations. There, in the middle of nowhere, the seed of her future career was being planted in the most unlikely soil possible. She spoke to fill the deafening silence of an existence that seemed to have no purpose. Her voice echoed across the empty fields, strong, clear, surprisingly adult for such a small child, as if her soul were far too old for that childish body. But her grandmother, Hattie Mae, was the supreme and relentless law of that small universe. A woman hardened by life in the racist South, she believed that the only way to protect a black girl was to teach her to be invisible and obedient. Hattie Mae's love was shown through brutal discipline, through the switch, the flexible tree branch used for beatings. "You need to learn how to behave," she would say, as the branch cut through the air and through the skin. The lesson was clear: disobedience leads to death. Hattie didn't beat her out of gratuitous cruelty. She beat her out of fear. Fear of what the white world would do to a black girl who dared to raise her head. She was trying to break Oprah's spirit before the world get it in a much worse way. It was an education based on survival, where submission was the only armor available. Despite the strictness, there were moments of strange, prophetic light. In the local church, that girl dressed in rags was transformed. When Oprah climbed onto the wooden crate to recite Bible verses at Easter, the congregation fell completely silent. There was a power in her diction, a contained fury, and an emotional understanding of the words that made the elderly ladies cry and shake their heads, murmuring, "Amen." Nicknamed the preacher, she discovered early on that words had power. They could change the atmosphere of a room. They could make people look at her not with pity, but with respect. In those brief minutes on the improvised altar, the potato sack disappeared. She was nothing but voice and spirit. It was the only place where she felt, in some way, divine. Life on the farm, however, had its brutal limits. Water had to be pumped from the well. The bathroom was an outdoor outhouse infested with insects, and the nights were pitch dark, filled only with the sound of crickets and the irrational fear of the unknown. Oprah slept dreaming of a world beyond the farm's fences, a world she saw only in the pages of the few books she managed to read. She learned to read at the age of 3, a feat her grandmother displayed with stern pride in church, but which at home was treated as just one more chore. Reading was her escape window. While her body was trapped in the mud of Mississippi, her mind traveled to places where black girls wore silk dresses and patent leather shoes. The gap between her reality and her dreams created an unbearable inner tension, a hunger no food could satisfy. The relatively secure yet harsh life on her grandmother's farm, however, was numbered. At 6 years old, fate moved its pieces in a cruel way. Her biological mother, Vernita, who had left in search of work in the North, decided she wanted her daughter back. Oprah was torn from the only world she knew, left by Hattie Mae at a train station with a new dress and a broken heart. The trip to Milwaukee was not an adventure. It was a descent into darkness. She was trading rural poverty, which at least had fresh air and space, for the claustrophobic, cold, dirty urban poverty of an industrial city. The culture shock was immediate and violent. The girl who talked to pigs was now surrounded by concrete, strangers, and a mother who was essentially a stranger herself, exhausted from work. In Milwaukee, the church's child prodigy became just another poor black child in an overcrowded ghetto. Vernita worked long hours as a domestic worker, leaving Oprah alone or under precarious care. Loneliness changed shape. It was no longer the contemplative solitude of the fields, but the dangerous isolation of an empty apartment in a tough neighborhood. Oprah's intelligence, once celebrated in the rural church, now made her a target. She was the girl who thinks she's better than everybody else, the avid reader in a place where physical survival was the top priority. She learned to hide inside herself, building mental walls to block out the city's noise and the indifference of her new reality. It was in this environment of neglect and vulnerability that the true horror began to seep in. Poverty leaves doors unlocked, not just physical doors, but the doors of child protection. At 9 years old, Oprah's innocence was shattered. Not by a stranger in a dark alley, but within the supposed safety of home and the extended family. The abuse began insidiously, stealing from her the only thing poverty hadn't already taken: ownership of her own body. A cousin, then a family friend, then an uncle. The betrayal was absolute. The girl who had charmed the church with her voice was forced into the most terrible silence of all. "Don't tell anyone," was both the implicit and explicit threat. The trauma created a fracture in Oprah's psyche. To survive, she had to disassociate. She learned to leave her own body while terrible things were happening to it. She became a master actress, smiling at school, reciting poems, being the model student, while inside she carried a corrosive secret that made her feel dirty, unworthy, and fundamentally broken. The shame was not hers, but she wore it as if it were that old potato sack, only now the roughness was on the inside, scraping her soul with every breath. She began to believe that her worth was tied only to what she could do for others or how she could please them to avoid pain. Rebellion began to boil up. Not the healthy rebellion of adolescence, but a distorted cry for help. At 13, unable to process the abuse and neglect, Oprah began running away from home, lying, stealing money from her mother's purse to try to buy the other children's acceptance. She was desperate to be loved, to be seen, to fill the black hole left by abandonment and sexual violence. The wild behavior was, in fact, a frantic search for control in a life where she had none. The school and social system saw only a juvenile delinquent in the making, one more statistic ready to be discarded into the prison system or perpetual poverty. The breaking point came at 14. The ultimate secret, the physical consequence of the abuse, and the desperate search for affection, Oprah was pregnant. A child carrying a child. In 1968, for a single black girl, this was the end of the line. It was the confirmation that she had failed, that she was immoral, that her future was sealed in shame. She hid the pregnancy under loose clothing and tight bands, suffocating the growth of another life while her own seemed to be ending. The terror of being found out, the fear of her mother's judgment and the world's, created a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. She was on the edge, staring into the abyss, about to fall and never return. The year 1968 brought the coldest winter of Oprah's life, not meteorologically, but spiritually. The pregnancy she had hidden with tight bands and loose clothes ended in a quiet, devastating tragedy. The baby, a boy she would later name Canaan, was born premature and died shortly after in the hospital. For a 14-year-old girl, that wasn't just a medical event. It was the confirmation that she was damaged goods. She lay in that hospital bed, empty, her body in pain and her soul in shreds, waiting for the final judgment. But what came was not the end. It was an exile that would become her salvation. She was sent to live with Vernon Winfrey in Nashville, Tennessee. A man she barely knew, an austere barber, church deacon, and city councilman who had no time for chaos. Vernon Winfrey did not offer warm hugs or sweet words of immediate comfort. He offered something Oprah had never had: structure. He looked at that broken, wild, traumatized girl and drew a line in the sand. "You've been given a second chance," he said with the gravity of a judge, referring to her survival after the pregnancy. "And you are not going to waste it." Vernon's house ran with the precision of a Swiss watch. There were schedules for everything, non-negotiable rules, and an expectation of excellence that bordered on militaristic. For someone coming from the chaotic neglect of Milwaukee, it felt like a prison. But for the first time in her life, Oprah was safe. The bars of that rigid discipline kept the monsters on the outside. Oprah's initial resistance was internal. She wanted to rebel. She wanted to scream, but Vernon's quiet, unshakable authority disarmed her. He did not accept average grades. A C on a report card was unacceptable in a home where potential was sacred. "If you can do better, you must do better," was the mantra. The punishment was not physical like her grandmother's. It was the disappointment in his eyes, which hurt far more. Vernon instituted an intellectual regimen. Oprah was required to read one book per week and hand in a written report on it, under the yellow light of a lamp, while her father checked the grammar and depth of her analysis. While other teenage girls were worried about dances and boyfriends, Oprah was dissecting Steinbeck and Hemingway at the kitchen table, under the yellow light of a lamp, while her father checked the grammar and depth of her analysis. Beyond the books, there was vocabulary. Vernon demanded that she learn 5 new words every day before dinner. There was no food if there were no words. It seemed like torture, but in truth, it was arming her. Each new word, tenacity, resilience, eloquence, was a brick in the construction of her new identity. She began to realize that the more words she possessed, the better she could describe the world and, more importantly, describe what she felt. Language stopped being just sound and became power. At East Nashville High School, the transformation began to show. The problem student from Milwaukee disappeared, replaced by an honor student who devoured the school curriculum as if she had been starving for years. School became her stage. No longer the shy girl or the delinquent, Oprah discovered that her ability to speak, the same one she had trained with the pigs on the farm, was a valuable social currency. She joined the drama club, the student council, the debate team. She was popular not because she was beautiful by the Eurocentric standards of the time, or because she had expensive clothes — she sewed many of her clothes herself to save Vernon's money — but because she was magnetic. When she spoke, the hallways stopped. There was an intensity about her, an urgency of someone who knows what it means to have no voice, that turned her class speeches into unmissable events. She learned to modulate her voice, to use silence, to look her audience in the eye. The bizarre and wonderful turning point came in an unlikely beauty pageant, Miss Fire Prevention. It was a small, local contest, but for a black girl in the South during the turbulent transition to racial integration, it was a minefield. When the judges asked what she would do with $1 million, the standard answer would have been something frivolous or vaguely charitable. Oprah, at 17, with diction forged by Vernon's book reports, answered with disarming sincerity. "I would spend the money on clothes and shoes because I come from a poor family and I've never had enough." The raw honesty, delivered with the elegance of a queen, shocked and delighted the judges. She won. The girl in the potato sack now wore a crown and a sash, smiling for the cameras, proving that her story of poverty didn't need to be hidden. It could be her strength. This victory drew attention. She was invited to visit a local radio station, WVOL, a station focused on the black community. When she walked into the studio, the smell of vinyl, stale coffee, and dusty carpet hit her like the perfume of destiny. When they put her in front of a microphone just for a voice test, the magic happened. The voice that came out of the speakers was not that of a 17-year-old teenager. It was deep, rich, authoritative, and velvety. It was a voice made for radio. The station manager was stunned. Right then and there, still in high school, Oprah was hired to read the afternoon news. It was a surreal double life. In the morning, she was a high school student dealing with algebra and teenage drama. In the afternoon, she was the voice of the news for Nashville's black community. She earned $100 a week, a fortune for someone who had grown up without shoes. But more than the money, the job at WVOL gave her validation. Strangers would call the station, praising her diction and her clarity. For the first time, she was being heard by thousands of people without needing to shout, without needing to be abused, without needing to hide. The microphone was both a shield and a sword. Vernon, listening to her on the radio in his barber shop while he cut hair, allowed himself a rare, restrained smile of pride. His method had worked. However, early success brought new kinds of isolation. She was too young for her coworkers and too mature for her schoolmates. Envy began to surface in the school hallways. "Who does she think she is?" they whispered. But Oprah already had thick skin. Vernon's discipline and surviving the traumas of Milwaukee had created an unbreakable work ethic. She arrived early, left late, and read the news with a seriousness that belied her age. She began to realize that journalism and communication were not just a job, they were a definitive escape route from poverty. She earned a full scholarship to Tennessee State University through a speech contest, ensuring that her education would continue. But destiny had bigger plans than local radio. Television was calling, and television was a completely different beast. Radio protected the body. Television exposed everything: skin color, weight, hair, nose. At 19, still in college, she received an offer to become the first black news anchor at WLAC-TV in Nashville. It was a leap into the abyss of total visibility in a South that was still struggling with racism. Vernon warned her to be cautious, to keep her feet on the ground, but Oprah felt the calling. She was about to enter an arena where her empathy would be seen not as a gift, but a fatal professional flaw. The first resistance had been overcome. The war for her identity was only just beginning. Baltimore, 1976. At 22, Oprah landed at WJZ-TV as a shining promise, the first black anchor of the 6 o'clock news. But Baltimore was not Nashville. It was a tough, cynical, and unforgiving market. If Nashville had been the school that welcomed her, Baltimore would be the forge meant to burn her alive to see what was left. The contract looked like a golden ticket, but it quickly revealed itself to be a gilded cage. The station's management looked at Oprah and didn't see talent. They saw a renovation project. To them, she was too black, too fat, too emotional, and too Southern. The order was given. She needed to be fixed. The attack started with the mirror. Management decided her look was not sophisticated enough for an urban audience. They sent her to an expensive beauty salon in New York for a modernization treatment. The result was a grotesque chemical disaster. The stylist applied a relaxer that was far too strong, burning her scalp and destroying the follicles. A week later, Oprah returned to Baltimore and, little by little, clumps of hair started to fall out. She had to go on the air night after night, wearing ill-fitting wigs and scarves, feeling like a fraud under the studio's bright lights. Every time the camera's red light went on, she smiled, but inside she was bald, hurt, and humiliated. The metaphor was brutal. The industry was literally ripping out her roots. The problem, however, went far beyond aesthetics. Traditional TV journalism required coldness. The anchor must be a blank slate, delivering facts without being affected by them. But Oprah suffered from an incurable flaw: chronic empathy. When she read a story about a fire where a family had lost everything, her voice would break. When she reported a murder, her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't read the teleprompter without feeling the pain in the words. The news director would shout in her earpiece, "Stop feeling, just read," but she couldn't. She cared. And in the cold world of hard news, caring was considered incompetence. The tension became unbearable. Executives called her into constant meetings, criticizing everything: the way she pronounced certain words, how big her eyes got when she was surprised, her fluctuating weight. She tried to shrink herself, tried to toughen up, tried to be the robotic journalist they wanted. But every attempt to erase her personality resulted in a stiff, strange performance. The ratings came in and were merciless. The audience did not trust her as a news anchor. She looked fake when she tried to be serious and too vulnerable to project authority. Then came the fatal blow. Less than 8 months after her triumphant arrival, Oprah was fired from the 6 o'clock news desk. They didn't let her go from the station, which would have been a mercy, but publicly demoted her. She was told she was unfit for television. The verdict hurt more than any switch beating from her grandmother. She had failed on the main stage. To fulfill the contract, the station dumped her into the programming graveyard, a local morning talk show called People Are Talking. It was a show nobody watched, made for bored housewives, considered the lowest rung on the television career ladder. The public fall unleashed her oldest inner demons. Food, which had always been a comfort, became her anesthetic. Alone in her apartment in Baltimore, feeling like a complete failure at 23, Oprah ate to fill the void of rejection. Bags of potato chips, pasta, sweets, she ate until it hurt, until the physical pain of a full stomach muffled the emotional pain of shame. The weight piled on, creating yet another layer of isolation between her and the world, another reason for the executives to look at her with disdain. She was trapped in a vicious cycle of self-sabotage and functional depression. In this dark period, she also looked for love in the wrong places. She got involved in a toxic and abusive relationship, reliving patterns from her traumatic childhood. She begged for affection from a man who treated her badly, projecting onto him the validation she didn't receive at work. It was rock bottom emotionally. Despite discovering her true talent, she was still stuck in Baltimore, in a local market, battling her weight, the bad relationship, and the deeply rooted belief that her career had hit the ceiling. She would spend the next few years there, polishing this new skill, but haunted by the fear that she would never get out of that hole, that true success was for women who were thin, white, and emotionally stable, everything she was not. Early 1980s. While the sun shone in the People Are Talking studio, darkness consumed Oprah's apartment when the cameras turned off. The audience saw a vibrant woman, capable of laughing loudly and hugging strangers, but no one saw the woman who went back home crawling into suffocating loneliness. She was trapped in a web of emotional dependence with a man who did not love her, a relationship that drained every drop of her newly gained self-esteem. She was a local celebrity in Baltimore, earned good money, but felt like an absolute fraud. How could she give advice on TV in the morning and accept crumbs of affection at night? The obsession reached dangerous levels. There were nights when she would drive to this boyfriend's house, park in the dark, and sit watching the lights in the window, praying to be invited in, praying to be chosen. In a moment of theatrical and pathetic desperation, she even wrote a fake suicide note, not because she wanted to die, but because she wanted him to feel sorry for her, to care. When he read the letter and reacted with indifference, something broke inside her. Not her heart, but the illusion. She was humiliating herself for love, repeating the cycle of rejection from her mother, her father, her childhood. At 29 years old, she was becoming the architect of her own destruction. The refuge, once again, was food. Oprah's weight swung violently, a visible barometer of her inner turmoil. She ate to stifle the voice that said she was ugly, unworthy, and destined to be alone. In a television world obsessed with the blonde thinness of Jane Pauley or Diane Sawyer, Oprah looked in the mirror and saw a black woman, overweight, and emotionally unstable. "You've hit your ceiling," the market said. The audition tapes she sent to major national networks came back or were ignored. The feedback was always the same, veiled or explicit: "You don't have the right look." Then came the rumor of an opportunity in Chicago. WLS-TV was looking for someone to take over AM Chicago, a morning show that was in last place in the ratings, a sinking ship no one wanted to captain. It was the graveyard of hosts. The direct competitor was Phil Donahue, the undisputed king of daytime television, an untouchable giant. Taking the job would be professional suicide. Going up against Donahue meant losing. But Oprah had nothing to lose. Baltimore was suffocating her. The night before her final audition in Chicago was the true zero moment. She didn't spend the night reviewing notes or resting to look good. She spent the night awake, crying, in one last, exhausting argument with the toxic boyfriend. They fought until dawn. When the sun came up, Oprah's eyes were swollen and red, her face tired and her soul drained. She looked into the hotel bathroom mirror and saw a disaster. "It's over," she thought. "No one is going to hire this broken woman." She walked into the audition room with Dennis Swanson, the station executive, carrying the weight of that night. There was no mask, no polished energy of a host trying to impress. There was only exhaustion and a brutal honesty. When the interview began, instead of trying to seem perfect, she admitted her flaws. When asked how she would handle the pressure, she didn't give a corporate answer. She talked about her struggle with weight, about her vulnerability, about how she was not perfect. At a crucial moment, her agent called, letting her know that Dennis Swanson wanted to see her again. Oprah assumed it was to deliver the no in person. She walked into his office prepared for rejection, with the "thank you for the opportunity" speech on the tip of her tongue. Swanson, a man who watched television through the eyes of the public and not the New York executives, looked at her. He didn't see the puffy eyes or the weight. He saw authenticity. He saw someone who could cross the screen and hold the viewer's hand. "You've got the job," he said. Oprah blinked, stunned. "But you know I'm black?" she blurted out, afraid he hadn't realized the risk he was taking in a racially divided city like Chicago. "I noticed," Swanson replied dryly. "And that I'm overweight? That doesn't matter," he said. "Just be yourself." The phrase echoed like thunder. Just be yourself. No one had ever said that to her as a professional instruction. It had always been, be thinner, be less black, be less emotional. Now her only instruction was to be the one thing she knew how to be when she wasn't trying to please anyone: Oprah. She went back to Baltimore to pack her bags, but the fear was paralyzing. She was trading the safety of known failure for the terror of failing on a much bigger stage. She was heading to the Windy City to face Phil Donahue, with a contract for only 4 years and the guarantee that if she failed, her career would be over. She packed her clothes, her books, and her traumas, got into a car, and drove north. She didn't know it, but she was driving toward a revolution. January 1984. The Chicago winter blew an icy wind that cut through the skin. But inside the WLS-TV studio, the heat was about to rise to nuclear levels. Oprah Winfrey took over AM Chicago with a suicidal mission: to go up against Phil Donahue. Donahue wasn't just a host, he was an institution. He invented the talk show format with audience participation. He was smart, white, male, articulate, and politically engaged. He was the head of America. Oprah decided to be the heart. Oprah's strategy wasn't to try to be smarter than Donahue, nor more journalistic. She did the unthinkable. She tore down the emotional fourth wall. On the premiere, she didn't sit behind a desk, shielded by stacks of questions. She walked among the people. She touched them. And, more shocking still, she used her own life as content. When the topic was dieting, she didn't bring on just a doctor. She talked about her own agonizing struggle with the scale. When the topic was abuse, she didn't cite statistics. She looked into the victim's eyes, and the silence said, "I know. I've been there." The impact was seismic. American television, until then a vehicle of plastic perfection and safe distance, was invaded by a raw, messy humanity. Housewives, used to being spoken to, suddenly felt that someone was talking with them. Oprah turned gossip into confession, and confession into mass group therapy. In just 1 month, 30 short, frenetic days, the show that had been in last place tied with Donahue. In 3 months, she surpassed him. The giant had fallen, brought down not by a stone, but by a hug. The potato sack girl had conquered the third largest city in America simply by being herself. But the universe had an even more dramatic card up its sleeve. Quincy Jones, the legendary music producer, was in Chicago on business and happened to turn on the TV in his hotel. He saw Oprah on AM Chicago and was hypnotized. He didn't see a host. He saw Sophia, the strong, tragic character from the book The Color Purple by Alice Walker, which Steven Spielberg was adapting for the screen. Quincy called the casting director immediately. Oprah, who had been secretly praying for a role in the film, feeling a spiritual connection to the book that portrayed the pain of Black women in the South, got the call. The audition for The Color Purple wasn't acting, it was an exorcism. To play Sophia, a woman who fights against abuse, racism, and attempts to break her spirit, Oprah didn't need to imagine the pain. She simply opened the basement door where she kept the traumas from when she was 9, the rejection, the early pregnancy, the switch beatings from her grandmother. In the scene where Sophia says, "All my life I had to fight," Oprah was screaming for every invisible Black girl in Mississippi. Spielberg cried. She got the part. The year 1985 was the year of the supernova. As the Oprah Winfrey Show, renamed in her honor and expanded to an hour, prepared to go national, the film premiered. Oprah's performance was visceral, a force of nature that stole the scene. She received an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress. In 1 year, she went from an unknown local host struggling with her weight to an Oscar-nominated movie star and the new queen of daytime television. The external validation was overwhelming, but the internal validation was the real revolution. She realized that her past pain wasn't garbage, it was narrative gold. The national premiere of The Oprah Winfrey Show on September 8, 1986, was the final blow. Distributed by King World, it entered millions of American homes. But Oprah, guided by a sharp business instinct that no one expected from the emotional one, made the deal of the century. Advised by her lawyer and agent, Jeff Jacobs, she didn't just accept a high salary. She founded Harpo Productions, Oprah spelled backward, and negotiated ownership of the tapes and the rights to the show. It was a radical decision. At that time, talents were employees. The studios were the owners. Oprah reversed the logic. She bet on herself. If the show failed, she would go broke. If the show took off, she would own the sky. And it did take off. America, tired of cynicism, embraced Oprah's authenticity with a desperate hunger. She became the nation's best friend, sister, and confidant. White, black, rich, and poor tuned in at 4 p.m. to see what she would say, what she would wear, and, above all, what she would feel. The unlikely turnaround was complete, but not without cost. Success brought unimaginable scrutiny. The tabloids hounded her, made up stories, mocked her weight, which fluctuated with stress. But now, Oprah had the platform. In 1988, in an infamous and iconic moment, she wheeled a cart with 67 pounds of animal fat onto the stage to represent the weight she had lost. It was theatrical, it was shocking, but it was real. America saw there not an untouchable goddess, but a woman fighting the same battle they were. She had reached the top of the mountain, but unlike others who get there and kick away the ladder, Oprah looked down and extended her hand. She began to change the focus of the show. No more trash TV, no more flying chairs and sensationalist paternity tests, common at the time. She decided to use her influence for something greater. Can television teach? She asked herself. The answer would define the following decades and transform her into the most powerful woman in the world. In the 1990s, American daytime television became a coliseum of freak shows. Talk shows exploited family fights, live paternity tests, and public humiliation in search of cheap ratings. The easy path was laid out. Shouting brings numbers. Oprah, reigning supreme, could have gone with the flow and swim in easy money. But the girl who used to read on her grandmother Hattie Mae's porch felt a sharp moral discomfort. She looked at the empire she was building and realized it had feet of clay if it was fed by other people's misery. In 1994, against all the advice of producers who feared ratings would drop, she made a radical decision. I'm no longer going to do television that diminishes people. I'm going to do television that lifts them up. Thus began the era of Change Your Life TV. It was a high-risk bet. At first, the audience wavered. People wanted blood, and Oprah was offering spirit. But she persisted, doubling down on her audience's intelligence. She introduced Oprah's Book Club. It was an old-fashioned idea, almost suicidal for commercial TV, stopping the show to talk about literature. The experts laughed. Nobody reads anymore, they said. But when Oprah held up a book and said, "Read this," America obeyed. The Oprah effect became an economic and sociological phenomenon. A seal with her name on the cover guaranteed that unknown authors became instant bestsellers, selling millions of copies overnight. She wasn't just selling books, she was democratizing high culture, proving that the housewife in Ohio and the executive in New York had the same hunger for meaning. Oprah's power transcended the screen. She became the nation's moral compass. When the mad cow scandal broke and she said she would never eat a hamburger again, beef prices plummeted on the stock exchange the very next day. Cattle ranchers in Texas sued her for defamation, dragging her into a courtroom in Amarillo. They wanted to silence her, to intimidate the black woman who dared to mess with the industry. But Oprah turned the trial into another episode of her show. She moved her program to Texas, broadcast from there, and walked out of the courtroom victorious, declaring, "Freedom of speech isn't just for people who agree with you." She proved she was untouchable, not out of arrogance, but because her influence was grounded in the public's absolute trust. They knew she could not be bought. As her cultural influence exploded, her financial shrewdness rewrote the history of Black capitalism. By keeping ownership of The Oprah Winfrey Show and founding Harbo Studios, she did something unprecedented. She wasn't anyone's employee. Every cent of profit, every creative decision went across her desk. In 2003, Forbes magazine made the announcement that shocked the financial establishment. Oprah Winfrey had become the first Black woman billionaire in history. The girl who used to wear dresses made from potato sacks now had a net worth greater than the economy of small countries. But unlike other billionaires, her wealth didn't stir resentment, it sparked celebration. For her audience, Oprah's victory was the victory of every woman who had ever been underestimated. Wealth, however, was only a means to an end. Oprah never forgot the poverty of Kosciuszko. She knew that the only difference between her and the millions of girls still trapped in misery was access to education, to books, to a chance. In a gesture of cosmic gratitude and historical responsibility, she turned her eyes to Africa. She promised Nelson Mandela that she would build a school in South Africa. Not just any school, but an academy of excellence for girls, as beautiful and well-equipped as the schools of the rich in America. The building of the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls was personal. She chose the sheets, the tiles, the books in the library. She interviewed the girls personally, seeing in each frightened yet hopeful face the reflection of her own childhood. When the school opened, critics called it elitist. Why spend so much on so few girls, they asked. Oprah answered with the logic of someone who had survived, because they deserve the best, because beauty inspires dignity. She was healing the wound of the girl who felt ugly and unworthy, making sure those new girls knew from the very first day that they were royalty. The height of her political and social influence came in a subtle but devastating way. Without ever having run for public office, her voice carried more weight than that of senators and governors. Her support for causes, for laws against child abuse, the Oprah Law was signed by Clinton, creating a national database of abusers, and, eventually, for political candidates, changed the course of history. She proved that soft power, the power of conversation, empathy, and connection, was stronger than brute force. But the price of glory was loneliness at the top. Oprah sacrificed a normal life. She chose not to have biological children, a decision often questioned by the media, but one she embraced with serenity, understanding that her calling was to be a mother to a multitude, not to a single individual. Her relationship with Stedman Graham lasted decades, not through a traditional marriage, but through a partnership that respected her fierce autonomy. She redefined what it meant to be a fulfilled woman. She didn't need the ring. She didn't need conventional motherhood. She was complete in herself. As the 2000s went on and the 25-year cycle of her show neared its end, the question hung in the air. What comes after the top of Everest? Oprah didn't want to grow old in front of the cameras doing the same thing until she became irrelevant. She wanted to leave at her peak, on her own terms. She announced that the 25th season would be the last. The world went into anticipatory mourning. It wasn't just the end of a show, it was the end of an era in which we had a safe place to go every afternoon, a place where America tried to understand itself. In the final episode, in 2011, she wasn't there as a celebrity saying goodbye. She was there as a teacher giving her last lesson. The stage was simple, just her, alone, under a spotlight, speaking directly to the souls of millions. She didn't talk about the celebrities she interviewed or the cars she gave away. She talked about the divine spark in each person. The invisible girl from Mississippi, who once wished only to have shoes, closed her cycle by telling the world, "You are enough." And for the first time in television history, the audience believed it, because the one saying it was living proof of the impossible. The studio lights went out in 2011, but Oprah's light did not. Many predicted that without the daily platform of broadcast TV, she would slowly fade into the gilded irrelevance of retirement. They were wrong again. Leaving the stage was not an end, it was a metamorphosis. Oprah launched OWN, Oprah Winfrey Network, a cable channel that initially staggered. The headlines turned cruel again. Oprah's billion-dollar blunder. Has she lost her touch? For a moment, the ghost of the Baltimore failure hovered. But the woman who survived sexual violence and rural poverty was not going to be intimidated by cable ratings. She rolled up her sleeves, restructured the company, had difficult conversations, and, with the patience of someone who tends the land, made the network blossom. She proved that resilience is not a single act, it is a lifelong habit. Today, on her property in Montecito, surrounded by gigantic trees and the silence she feared so much as a child, Oprah walks with the calm of a general who has won the war without firing a shot. She is no longer just a host, she is a modern sage. Her interviews are no longer about promoting movies, but about dissecting the human soul. Sitting down with princes, presidents, and survivors, always seeking the common thread that binds us. The girl who talked to pigs because she had no friends became the world's confidant, the living proof that attentive listening is the purest form of love. The defining moment of this new era came in 2018 at the Golden Globes. When receiving the Cecil B. DeMille Award, Oprah took the stage dressed in black, in solidarity with the Time's Up movement. When she grabbed the microphone, the room, filled with the most powerful people in Hollywood, shrank. She told the story of Reese Taylor, a black woman raped in 1944 who never saw justice, and she connected that brutal past to a present of hope. With the thunderous voice that once echoed in the wooden churches of Mississippi, she declared, "I want all the girls watching here, now, to know that a new day is on the horizon." In that moment, there was no script, no teleprompter. There was only the gravitational force of a woman who turned every stone thrown at her into a step to climb higher. Some even asked her to run for president. She smiled and declined. She knew she already held a far more important lifetime position, chief inspirer of humanity. Oprah Winfrey's legacy is not in the billions of dollars, the schools built, or the awards on the shelf. The true legacy is invisible and omnipresent. It is in the woman who decided to leave an abusive relationship because she saw Oprah talk about dignity. It is in the man who learned to read as an adult because he watched the book club. It is in the black girl who looks at the screen and sees a reflection of possibility, not limitation. Oprah taught the world that vulnerability is not weakness, it is the ultimate superpower. She validated emotional pain as something real and treatable, helping to heal an entire generation of its silent traumas. The greatest irony of her life is also her greatest victory. Segregated Southern society tried to teach Oprah two things: that she was ugly and that she should stay quiet. She spent her life proving the opposite, becoming the most beautiful woman in the eyes of those who listened to her and the most irrepressible voice of the century. The potato sack that scratched her skin was replaced by fine fabrics, But the memory of that roughness kept her humble. She never forgot what it feels like to be less, and so she dedicated her life to making others feel more. When we look at her journey, we see the perfect architecture of the unlikely hero. Rejection was her training in self-reliance. Poverty was her training in empathy. Abuse was the fire that forged her need for truth. Nothing was wasted. The universe used every tear of little Hattie Mae to water the soul of the woman Oprah. She is the definitive proof that your past is not a sentence. It is simply the origin story of your power. The final image is simple. Oprah sitting under an oak tree in her garden, reading a book with her dogs at her feet. She closes the book, breathes in the clean air of freedom, and looks straight at us. Her eyes, which have seen the worst of humanity and chosen to believe in the best, convey one last silent message. I made it. And because I made it, you know you can too. The invisible girl became the light of the world. And the darkness, however dense it may be, never, ever could put her out. The end.